Have you developed a pattern of putting off difficult conversations with your spouse for the sake of keeping the peace? If that sounds like you, then in this video, you're going to learn why that pattern is potentially causing more damage to your relationship, to your marriage, than what you think it could be. And I'm also going to share with you a contributing factor behind what drives this particular pattern and what opened my eyes to that particular cause behind it as well. And you might find it a little bit surprising because I sure did when it happened to me and when I had that realization. So stick around for that. Hi, my name is Julie. I'm a lover of Jesus. I am a life coach, rapid transformational therapy practitioner, and this channel is all about equipping you with strategies, tools, tips, tactics to help you reframe your perspective about what's happening in your world right now. Why? Because when you reframe a situation, you see things in a different light, and that is where breakthrough begins. Who am I to talk about this particular topic of having a pattern of avoiding difficult conversations for the sake of keeping the peace? Well, I've been married for over 33 years now, so yes, I've picked up a couple of gems along the way, including this one of what not to do. I was a chronic conflict avoider. That means I would avoid the risk of all the things that could potentially go wrong from having a difficult conversation by not having them. Well, as much as I could avoid them anyway. And talk about classic overthinking. I could be the only one here. Maybe you can relate on that. My head would get in such a spin. Do I mention this? How do I mention it? Maybe it's not a good time. If I start the conversation, what if it derails and goes really south? All these sorts of things. Do you justify putting off potentially difficult conversations because you're worried about how your spouse might react? Do you tell yourself things like, isn't the right time, or it's not that important, or I'm probably overthinking this anyway? Well, look, there's no question that there are times when the timing is not right. For example, it's the end of the day, you're tired, they're tired, not a good time to start what could be a difficult conversation. Speaking from my own experience, a lot of anxiety would come up just because most of the time I didn't know how to frame the conversation and navigate it well. For me, I'd make my point and then make assumptions about the meaning behind what my husband would say in response. And then I would get upset. Now, remember at the start of the video, I mentioned that when there is a pattern of keeping the peace, there's a risk of causing more damage to your marriage than actually helping it. Here's what I learned. So my husband served in the Australian Army for over 13 years, and a lot of that time he was either training or deployed overseas. He'd come home and thrilled to be home and just thrilled to also step back into being the family man that he loved to be. I wanted him to relax and settle back into the rhythm of the household, and so I kept important conversations from him or putting them on the shelf for the right time. He didn't want me to worry about him and what was really going on in here, so he was keeping important conversations that he was struggling with on the shelf as well. Both of us developed this same habit. Yes, there was peace, but it was just on the surface. I didn't challenge him about his drinking, and he didn't tell me what he was really struggling with. And below the surface, there was so much going on and so much building up until it all imploded. One night, he decided he wanted out, and he drove his car at speed into the front of a parked truck. Now, miraculously, he was uninjured. But in the days and the weeks and the months that followed that event, comprehending what he tried to do, there was no avoiding the difficult conversations we had to have. Messy, painful, raw conversations for our marriage to survive and get through this. But here's the irony. In all the times we were avoiding the difficult conversations and we had surface level peace, when we worked through those hard conversations, it led over time to a depth of peace in our marriage instead of being only surface level. It deepened our sense of connection. We learned more about each other, our needs, our values, our boundaries, our fears, our hopes, our expectations of one another, and most importantly, our faith in God. Now, let me deviate for a second here with a little bit of a side story for context. Before my husband and I met, we were in our early 20s, living our own lives and doing our own thing, oblivious to each other's existence at the time. But both of us, before we met, experienced a life-changing encounter with God. That encounter led me and led him to give our lives over to Jesus from that moment forward. And for both of us, about 12 months after those events, when we did meet for the first time, it was at a conference that neither of us had any intention of going to. I remember at the time my mother was a nurse working shifts, and she'd bought the ticket and got called into work at the last minute, so gave it to me. My future husband was involved in youth ministry, and so his youth pastor bought him a ticket. But anyway, we found ourselves at this conference. And so remember, my future husband didn't really want to be there, and so he was sitting right up the back row, as far away from the front as he could get. And he was just saying, "It's just me and you, God, it's just me and you." Until he heard someone laugh, and he got kind of curious and was like looking, trying to peer over the crowd. Who is that? Couldn't quite see where the laughter came from, and he's just me and you, God. And then he heard the laugh again. Anyway, I had seen him, and the laugh was me, by the way. I'd seen him during the time of the conference. I remember this vividly, where I walked into the kitchen to get something, and he was standing at the kitchen sink, white shirt, blue denim jeans, 6'2", sunlight streaming in, and I literally stopped mid-step, turned around and walked out again. Anyway, we didn't speak, not until the last day of this conference. And on that afternoon, the father of the family I'd travelled to this conference with, his name was Arthur. He was walking down the centre row between all of the seats, and I was walking behind him, and he deviated to a small group that were talking, and he reached out to shake my future husband's hand and introduced himself, said, "Hi, my name's Arthur." My husband said his name, and then Arthur turned and said, "And this is Julie," and introduced us to each other. We exchanged phone numbers because we're both involved in youth ministry. But here's the thing. He went home that day and said to his dad, "Dad, I've just met the girl I'm going to marry." And his dad probably had a bit of a chuckle, but then my husband thought to himself, "You know what? I'll just check in with God here." And he said, "God, if she's the one for me, I want her to call me by 5 o'clock tomorrow." I called at exactly 4:59 p.m., 1 minute before 5 o'clock. There's so much more to this story, always more to the story of how God confirmed his will in our marriage, but the shortened version is simply this. We got engaged 2 months after we met and married 6 months after that. And 2025 will be our 34th anniversary. Now, here's my point and the reason why I deviated with this little story. Having God's clear sign of approval in marriage is no guarantee that everything will be rainbows and unicorns and the land of happily ever after. Hard, painful, heartbreaking, and traumatic things still happen. Faith does not equal instant immunity from these things, but it's how we navigate our faith through them that matters. Now, at the beginning of this video, I talked about an unexpected contributor that I discovered, and perhaps you can relate to this as well, behind my pattern of avoiding conflict at all costs by keeping the peace no matter what. So while I was doing my studies to become an accredited life coach, I was wrapping those studies up, and I then shifted gears to become what's called a rapid transformational therapy practitioner. I recognized the value of this particular skill set to add to my coaching toolkit, because while coaching is typically future focused on an outcome or goal, RTT deals with the root cause of a belief that keeps sabotaging the area of growth in your life that you want to change. So perhaps you've never heard of RTT before. So what is it? Well, RTT is a powerful and practical method that helps you uncover the root cause of the thoughts, beliefs, and behaviors that are keeping you stuck. Using a combination of techniques from hypnosis, cognitive behavioral therapy, and neuroplasticity principles, RTT enables you to access your subconscious mind, reframe old patterns, and install new empowering beliefs. So, while I was learning how RTT works, I identified in myself a root cause behind my pattern of avoiding conflict. And it was based on a belief that I had formed in my childhood. I had memories of my parents arguing, and when I was 10 years old, my mother left home. Now, my 10-year-old mind at the time applied a meaning and a belief to that experience that if two people who love each other have a fight, one of them will leave. Now, I subconsciously carried that belief into my adulthood and into my marriage. So part of my motivation in keeping the peace and avoiding conflict was influenced by this belief that if I say something that leads to an argument, the person I love will leave. In fact, I saw something similar show up for a client recently that I had coached who was really anxious about how her husband would respond to a difficult conversation that she needed to have with him where much was at stake. So I worked with her on this to role play the conversation. And as a result of that process, she could suddenly see how her own patterns and interpretations were impacting her and influencing the way that she was framing the conversation. Now, here's one thing that you can do proactively to start leaning into an important conversation instead of avoiding one. And it doesn't involve any talking yet. Sit down with a notebook and a pen and just ask yourself a couple of questions to help get some clarity. Here are the questions. What story am I telling myself about this particular situation that I want to talk about? Is that story based on facts, assumptions, or is it based on past hurt? How might I see this differently if I paused for a moment to get curious? The most important thing for you to remember is that when you start tuning in to what's really going on inside you, perspective starts to shift. Let me know in the comments below what resonated with you from this video. And if you like the idea of using a resource to get that clarity and continue working with some prompting questions to help just sift through all of the noise that can go on here and get really clear, then click the link below because I've got a resource for you that I've developed just for you for that specific purpose, to turn down the volume of the noise and get really clear about what's on your heart and what you want to express, what you want to communicate with your spouse. I know it worked well for me, so I hope you find it useful too.